hyperscale data centers in Wisconsin. So last month we released Big Tech Unchecked. That is our toolkit for community action. This is a resource that's meant to help inform communities about the ongoing data center boom in Wisconsin and how you can get involved with it. And tonight we're going to be hitting the highlights of that toolkit. Um, Cassie, would you be able to pull up or Elizabeth, would you be able to pull up the slides? All right, there we go. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so first let's introduce tonight's speakers. My name is Michael Greif. I'm with Midwest Environmental Advocates, and I'm joined tonight by Brittany Keys with Healthy Climate Wisconsin, Elizabeth Ward with Sierra Club Wisconsin chapter, Melissa Johnson of Wisconsin's GreenFire, and Cassie Steiner with Sierra Club, again, Wisconsin chapter. And we can move on to the agenda. Okay, so tonight's agenda looks like this. We're going to start by touching on why these hyperscale data centers are coming to Wisconsin and talking about what some of our concerns with that is. We'll also talk about the approval and permitting process, both at the state and local level. And then we're going to talk about how you can get involved and engage with this issue. And then we'll wrap up with a Q&A. So next slide. Before we do that, just a few reminders. If you have a question, use that Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to it at the end of the webinar. I'll also say that this session will be recorded and we will send it out in a follow-up email that will also include some additional action steps that you can take to stay engaged with the issue. Next slide. So we're going to start off on a positive note, which is that local organizing and advocacy is making a difference on this issue. Several companies have already abandoned plans for data centers around the state in response to local opposition. We've also seen both Democrats and Republicans introduce bills in the state legislature on this issue. And the only reason that is happening is because of grassroots advocacy and engagement. So while these issues can feel insurmountable, local communities can win on this issue and are continuing to win on this issue. And that's why we're so appreciative that you're here tonight. So let's go on to the next slide and get into the meat of the presentation. Start it off just to clarify what a hyperscale data center is. So data centers are essentially warehouses filled with computer servers, and they've been around for decades. However, in recent years, they've gotten much, much larger, and that's largely driven by artificial intelligence. And there's not an agreed definition of when a data center becomes a hyperscale data center, but it basically just means it's a very large facility. These are typically hundreds or even thousands of acres on a campus, and they're usually owned or leased by companies that are the biggest, richest companies. You've probably heard of them, companies like Meta, Amazon, Google, Microsoft. Next slide. And these hyperscale data centers have been coming to Wisconsin really since 2023. It kicked off with Microsoft building an AI data center on the Foxconn site in Mount Pleasant. And since then, we've seen proposals around the state, Beaver Dam, Port Washington, DeForest, and other communities as well. And there's been a few trends that really led to that boom. The first was private sector investment into AI. Tech companies are pouring hundreds of billions of dollars into developing artificial intelligence. And the data centers we're seeing built are really the physical infrastructure that's needed to build and run those models. We also saw the state of Wisconsin adopt tax exemptions in 2023 That means that the tech companies don't have to pay sales tax on the equipment that they put into a data center. And of course, that exemption essentially decreases the amount of money that Wisconsin has for other priorities like roads, schools, parks, and things that benefit our communities. And then the other piece of this puzzle, which I need to mention, is um, recruitment by electric utilities. So we've seen utilities like We Energies and Alliant recruit data centers to come to Wisconsin because they understand they're very large consumers of energy, and that allows the utilities to drive up energy demands and ultimately increase their profits. All right, and then we'll move right ahead. Um, so we're going to talk now about the concerns with this trend and why we as environmental and community advocates see some alarms going off. So the first issue is transparency. Um, Tech companies like to tightly control the information related to their developments. And unfortunately, local officials are often playing along with that. So some of the forms this can take is we've seen non-disclosure agreements between local officials and data center developers. These NDAs often prevent local officials from sharing basic information about a proposal, including its size, water use, energy demands, even the company that's behind it. We've also seen the use of anonymous LLCs, which companies use to hide their identity in the early stages of a project. And that makes it really difficult for residents to assess who is behind a project. And then we've also seen tech companies invoke claims of trade secrets to withhold key information about a project's impacts, things like water consumption or energy use. And then a final piece of this is, unfortunately, local governments have been enabling a lot of this secrecy by holding closed door meetings that prevent the public from understanding key details of these data center proposals. Unfortunately, Wisconsin does have key open government laws that communities can use to push back on all of this data center secrecy. And those include the public records law, which comes with a strong presumption that you, as a member of the public, have access to government records and documents. And that applies to state, county, and local levels of government. We also have the open meetings law, which generally allows public access to meetings, and there's some exceptions with that law. However, generally there's a presumption that governmental meetings are held in open session, which you can attend. And then finally, there's also Wisconsin's Environmental Policy Act, or WEPA, which is a environmental impact disclosure law. It requires state agencies to assess and disclose the environmental impacts before taking an action, such as approving the permit for a project. Okay, and I'm now going to turn it over to Brittany.
Thanks, Michael. Um, I'm going to walk through some of the other concerns with data centers with sections that are within the toolkit. This includes data center, hyperscale data center impacts on electricity, our energy bills, health, public health, community health, our land and water, as well as light and noise pollution. Next slide. So these hyperscale data centers use a lot of energy. And one report from Clean Wisconsin shared that of the five big proposals that they were dealing with at the time, only two had disclosed their potential energy use. And that was Microsoft's data center in Mount Pleasant and Vantage Data Center in Port Washington. And those two combined would require 3.9 gigawatts of electrical power or electricity, which is excuse me, enough to power 4.3 million Wisconsin homes. And appreciating Wisconsin only has 2.8 million, it is clear that just two of these hyperscale data centers will require more than all the households in Wisconsin. Another way to frame this is that when you think of 3.9 gigawatts, think of Orlando, Florida, times four. So these require a lot of energy, and this is just from two of the proposals. Next slide. And this will cause a lot of strain and stress on our electricity grid and additional impacts. And one of those is from utility, it'll impact utility profits. As Michael alluded to, they're working to draw these data centers to the state. And it's because the way the profit structure is that Wisconsin utilities are guaranteed 9.8 to 10% return on equity or profits for all the infrastructure they build. And so they're incentivized to build out more and build big and invest in like new fossil fuel infrastructure to get that return throughout the lifetime of the projects. And we have, there's memos that we have seen that, example in Port Washington, their power and their capacity expanded over 3 times after a proposal and encouragement from We Energies. We're also seeing new gas plants being built and proposed in Wisconsin, with Oak Creek and Paris recently getting 2 new gas plants approved from the regulators this last year to do a couple more gas plants being proposed to meet the needs specifically of the energy demand for these AI data centers. And all of this will impact our energy bills. Now we know that these developers and utilities have said, oh, they're going to pay their way, there will be no impact. But looking at, there's 2 rate cases in front of the Public Service Commission right now, and looking at those details, that is not what they're proposing. There is going to be, looks as it stands now, significant cost shift and impact for ratepayers. And there'll be more information on that specifically later and how we can get involved. And another big concern is especially these fossil fuel developments to meet the need of the data centers might become stranded assets. And if they're able to build them out, but even if they're not needed anymore, a stranded asset is infrastructure that customers must continue to pay for, even if it's not being used. And there's examples in Wisconsin now, but this is a significant concern for the public having to pay out these projects throughout the lifetime of the project, even if they're not being used. Next slide. And then there's health impacts. And as a health professional, I can say that the research is working to catch up. We're all feeling these proposals come out at us fast and furious. And so we are working to appreciate what research is coming out. So next slide. But we can say that there are significant health impacts from direct and indirect sources. This There is a really good webinar brought to you by Nature Forward about this study quantifying and addressing the public health impacts of data centers. We'll drop that in the chat where Dr. Wren walks us through kind of putting that all together. And we'll go next slide. I'm just going to go over the top high level overview. And one of the most significant health impacts from data centers comes from um, the air pollution, both on site from the backup generators, and then even more so from scope 2 or the indirect from the fossil fuel energy sources built to meet the needs. And this comes from particulate matter, SO2, NOx or NO2, and VOCs, which together can form to create ozone. So this air pollution, both from direct and indirect, is what can impact our health significantly. Next slide. And one of the big takeaways, as we're seeing new gas plants and coal being built and proposed and coal plants stay on longer, is that the EPA acknowledges that fossil fuel burning power plants remain the leading source of air and water and land pollution in the United States. And currently, data centers are resulting in them staying on longer and more being built. So if when we're looking at public health impacts to the environment, climate, these are really compromising our health and progress in healing our environment. Another big thing to highlight is that these pollutants are regional. So yes, we care about the pollution in the data center or the gas plant in our backyard, but we also are impacted by the proposals and fossil fuel generating power plants that are states away. We breathe everything that's in the air that comes towards us. So we need to care about what's being proposed in our community, throughout the state, and really nationally, right? This impacts all of us. So this study looked to quantify the air pollution from the backup diesel generators, direct and the indirect from the gas plant and fossil fuel burning power plants. It used a publicly available modeling tool. Next slide. And it results from Virginia, which really is the data center sacrifice zone of, if not the world, definitely the US. They found just from the backup diesel generators alone, so just scope one, there'd be 2 to 300 million dollars in public health harms every year. So that is very significant. So again, one of the first studies trying to quantify it. If you want to learn more, highly recommend watching that full webinar. Next slide. Water impacts. Most of the developers have now, we know water impacts are significant. Most of the developers of these hyperscale data centers are saying they're going to use closed loop systems, which significantly reduces it. However, it requires more energy. And so again, we're looking at direct and indirect impacts. And if it requires more energy, it's going to require more water to be used to get that energy, indirect consequence here. And then again, it is tough to get the data. It is tough to get the information because there's not a lot of transparency and a lot of information hidden behind trade secrets. Next slide. Another report from Clean Wisconsin emphasizes that roughly already 70% of our water withdrawals are attributed to fossil fuel burning energy generation. So if data centers use fossil fuel, expand the fossil fuel energy generation, that's going to again tax our water in Wisconsin more. And they found that if Vantage, given the amount of energy they're going to require, if they use non-renewable energy sources to meet those needs, their offsite water use would be at least 54 million of gallons of water every day, and that's double the amount used by every home, business, and manufacturer in the city of Green Bay. Next slide. Another thing to emphasize with water pollution is that the EPA is trying to push forward and deregulate as far as the different chemicals that might be put in the water and polluted with these AI data centers. So this is a press release from the EPA. So this really just underscores that the EPA and DNR processes that are there to protect us are really not holding up right now. Next slide. And so impacts of water and land, there's significant concerns for PFAS. Again, we're not able to quantify it well, but that is there. This will impact in rising water bills. And then we're already seeing the impacts of land use in degradation of wetlands, farmland, natural spaces, and the harms associated with that. Next slide. And finally, Port Washington is already experiencing the light and the sound pollution from the construction phase with their 24-hour construction operations happening there. But when the data center is up and operational, it will have between 50 and 98 decibels of sound pollution. Closer to the facility is greater, and it's appreciated that right around 70 is the threshold where you may experience hearing loss. And then it's also known that light pollution is harmful for humans and nature, and that if these are being built, recommend that they apply the recommendations that are within the toolkit to mitigate harm. And next slide.
Hello, so I'm just going to go through very briefly what permissions data centers need in order to be able to move forward. While there is no statewide regulatory process in place for data centers specifically, there are a few requirements. First, they're going to need approvals from the local governments, and Melissa's going to go over that after me in a second, so she'll go over that in detail. If they also need permission to pollute the amount of air pollution Brittany just touched on, both from their on-site or for their on-site diesel generators that many have. So they're called air permits. They get those from the Department of Natural Resources. If a data center is to impact a major waterway or wetland, many of them do because they have these huge campuses and take up so much space. They need a wetlands and waterways permit. And then both of those last two I just mentioned, the air permit and the wetland and waterway permits, both of those come from the Department of Natural Resources and are subject to what Michael mentioned at the beginning, the Wisconsin Environmental Policy Act. So they're required to have an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement written up on them that describes the environmental impacts of the project. Many or all of these, depending upon what we're talking about with local permits, often have a way for the public to engage and voice their concerns or suggestions for ways to protect. And Cassie's going to go into how to participate in the process later. And then data centers aren't subject to a lot of approvals under the Public Service Commission, but utilities are. So Brittany mentioned one of the major concerns with data centers is just the massive amount of electricity they use. And so the entities that provide that electricity are our utilities, which are all regulated by the Public Service Commission. So these are, We Energies, Alliant Energy, Excel, et cetera, who you pay your electricity bills to. The only utilities not regulated by the Public Service Commission or PSC is if you are in a co-op area, so Dairyland Co-op or its member co-ops. That means that not directly regulating data centers, but regulating utilities, the Public Service Commission has a massive role to play in protecting Wisconsinites from some of these worst impacts of data centers. So their first big role is approving the infrastructure. So this is the new power plants and transmission lines that are required in order to provide this much electricity to the data centers. Last year, many of you probably saw there was a huge campaign as We Energies proposed the two new gas plants on the southeastern part of Wisconsin in order to serve the Microsoft data center. And we're continuing to see tons of new power plant proposals and new transmission lines come through for the purpose mostly of data centers. And then all of that new infrastructure is very expensive, like Brittany said, and it often includes a return on investment, which just goes directly to utilities profits. So the Public Service Commission is also responsible for ensuring that we aren't overpaying for those costs. So it approves rates that the utilities can charge customers. It does that. And then it also is embarking on a new process to set a specific rate for data centers. So this would be a special rate for data centers. This is a new process and will be precedent setting. So it's really important. It's a really important time to be engaging. And before I turn it over to Melissa, I just want to touch base on that even more so because we're at such a critical point, and Cassie's going to talk about how you engage on this later, and Michael, as we close, will talk about how to learn more about this issue. But fundamentally, the Public Service Commission is asking the question about how much should they pay for this new electricity demand. So the new infrastructure that is created when we're about to double the amount of electricity Wisconsin needs. The decision in this case will either protect us from paying the costs and footing the bill for the data centers, or it could end up resulting in us subsidizing these massive tech companies. So these are huge questions. Alliant Energy has proposed working through this by having a case-by-case agreement with data center owners and how much each individual data center owner will pay for its big electricity So that is before the Public Service Commission now. And then We Energies is taking a little different approach. They're asking the Public Service Commission to approve a special rate for all customers of a certain size. So that would basically be one standard rate that they would charge data centers. Currently, We Energies is suggesting that data centers only pay about 75% of their cost. Some of the other key things that will come up is how much should they pay? Like I said, making sure the definition of what a large customer is covers all data centers. We Energy's current proposal has one of the largest threshold in the country, which means a lot of the data centers could fall through the cracks. Other questions will be how long they should have to pay these rates. If they walk away, should they still be on the hook for helping to pay for the infrastructure that was created? And then one of the other big pieces in this is whether or not, and I saw this was one of the questions asked, they should be required to be fueled by clean energy, because adding a whole bunch of gas onto the grid means that when gas prices spike or lower, everybody who uses gas infrastructure will be subject to those volatile prices, and you could end up creating such a demand for gas that we all suffer. We'll go into more of this in future, but that's just a little highlight. And with that, I will send it over to Melissa to talk about local approvals.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. We appreciate you taking the time this evening. I'm going to be talking a little bit about what we can do at the local level and how we should be thinking about these projects. Instead of reacting to them, I think it's important for us to consider how we can be proactive. I see comprehensive planning, I'll talk about that in a little bit, land use plans and zoning ordinances. They are declarations of a community's value. Where do you want your residential? Where do you want your commercial? Where do you want your road infrastructure? Where do you want your industrial infrastructure? It is important, I believe, for communities to think long-term when it comes to data centers and how they fit or don't fit into a community. And the map you see behind you is actually a land use plan, or not, it's a land use plan, and it's just showing the different components of it. Next. So comprehensive plans are kind of that 40,000 foot long range planning document. Every community in Wisconsin is supposed to have a comprehensive plan, and sometimes there's a city plan and then a county plan. These plans are required by statute, and they're supposed to contain these components. Again, that's at 40,000 foot. Where do you want to see your community in 20 years? I can tell you when comprehensive planning first came on the scene, this was the early 2000s, data centers were not a thing. We didn't think about them. Where did they fit in this? So there's shortcoming in having that long range planning because we can't see into the future for these sort of things. Next. So land use plans, and again, in the background there is the city of Stevens Point where I live. That's our land use plan. It's showing our zoning areas. Some of the areas highlighted show the residential areas, as I said. The objective is to, I'm going to say this very clearly, promote the current and future interests of individuals and their community. Your land use plan is connected to the values you hold as a community, what you wish to protect, and what you value. Next. When you're thinking about land use plans and zoning, there's this thing called extraterritorial jurisdiction. Again, this is Stevens Point again. Stevens Point has the ability, because it's a city, to actually do planning, overlay planning into neighboring jurisdictions. So that extra area, the city of Stevens Point actually has the ability to say, we need to review town of Stockton, how you're doing things within this extraterritorial area. Why this is important, because we're seeing a lot of data centers not placing themselves in the middle of a municipality like Stevens Point. We don't have 800 acres in the middle of town for a data center, but neighboring jurisdictions within that extraterritorial area could have that extra property. And so those cities want to make sure that they're very cognizant of what their neighbors are doing when it comes to zoning, and any sort of developments that could be related to data centers or other large developments. Next. So your zoning codes interpret that land use plan that I just showed you. Those are the laws. They're municipal law, and they do lay out everything that's permitted or expected to be conditionally permitted within your community. This is where your permits come in. Your zoning code, along with your local ordinances, may lay out a wide variety of expectations. If your community does not currently or is not currently planning to include some semblance of how it will handle the advent of data centers, get going on it now. I can't stress that enough. If you don't have it in place, you cannot come in retroactively and zone out something you don't want. So consider getting your zoning ordinances in place. Think about where you may want them or may not want them. Think about the things you value, where you want to put them. What are the performance standards that you expect for these industrial uses? Again, what kind of screening do you want? How do you want noise handled? What about the smoke and emissions? Do you have vulnerable communities? Let's say a hospital. What is the distance you want between that? So the permitting comes in when that developer comes in and after they've secured some development agreements, which, as Michael said, can happen in the dark. Now they come to the municipality and they say, City of Stevens Point, we want a permit to build a data center in your industrial park. The city will begin its work to evaluate a wide variety of things on that, including a conditional use permit, so listing out the conditions for that expectation, or follow permitted use requirements. But if you don't have these things in place, you will be scrambling to try and figure out how best to manage all of the negative consequences of the influx of a large data center. Next. The successes of doing proactive zoning is really important. We saw what happened with Menominee City Council. Even though it wasn't proactive, they are now in the process of doing zoning that will protect their community, and they are stating their values. This is what we expect. This is what we want. This is what we don't want. Next. Direct legislation. So some communities are starting to, stakeholders are starting to say, you know what, we want to do something. We want to petition the government in our community to stop the advent of data centers or whatever. You can petition your local government through direct legislation, and here is the statute that guides that, and how you can do that so that you can do it legally. There are some things you cannot do, but you can petition the government if your government is not doing what you want related. You can't change zoning codes, but you can certainly petition your local government to start building the capacity to do this. Next. Annexation, we're starting to see communities annex in order to accommodate data centers into there's a couple out in Virginia that I looked at. They ended up gobbling most of their neighboring township in order to accommodate. It was a rural township adjacent to a moderately sized city. They annexed because the property owners wanted to annex because they had a developer's agreement to make a whole lot of money by selling their farmland. Now they want to annex. So annexation codes are very prescriptive. It is not unheard of to have property owners want to move their jurisdiction through annexation. So these are the rules or the legal framework for annexation. One little misstep, and that can stop an annexation process. So if you're watching a development that may be coming into your community and they're starting to annex, make sure that you or folks you work with are very up to speed on what that process is. And If you see one misstep, you might be able to stop that process. Next. My qualifications here are that I received this information from a wide variety of sources, incredibly great people who are far more gifted in land use and zoning and direct legislation and ballot initiatives. If you need information, this information is great. I also encourage you, if you're starting to get into direct legislation, ballot initiatives, petitions, please, please, please contact an attorney to help guide you on that process. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So now that we've listened to a lot of really great information that, again, this is just a summary of what's in the toolkit. If you want to dig deeper in any of these topics, I recommend that you check out the toolkit, and also we'll have follow-up events that will dig deeper. But part of the toolkit is what you can do to take action and protect your community. So one section of this part of the toolkit is about organizing your community. And we have seen that doing this early and often is the key to stopping these proposals in your community. People should be watching their city council agendas and zoning committee meetings. You should talk to your neighbors. If a proposal like this comes forward, gather a core team that can take action on this. You're already arming yourself with the facts, but learn those details of the local impacts from the specific proposal in your area. Set a goal and a plan, hold community meetings, and then make sure that as you work together, you're assigning specific roles to different people who want to help, you're spreading the word, and you're showing up together. And that unifying work is really what we're seeing, either delaying or stopping proposals or introducing strong guardrails in various communities. That's great. Another section of the Take Action part of the toolkit that I'm not going to dig in deep here is about different media opportunities. So we have a section on how to write a letter to the editor, what different social media resources you can use, and how you pitch to reporters to make the news and get ready for any press interviews. And I think something I'd like to add here is just that in a lot of these areas where these are proposed, a lot of people are not used to having media attention, statewide or national media attention. And so it is okay if you're an advocate in your community to take time to prepare what you want to say to press. If they come calling at a bad time, to schedule with them. There are tools for how you can talk to media in the toolkit as well. The thing I want to dig a little bit deeper on, because this is timely, as Elizabeth mentioned, is testifying and submitting comments. And this is relevant at every decision in the process. I will say that a lot of these proposals are not transparent, and so there are sometimes non-disclosure agreements that are signed, deals that are happening behind the scenes, but you have to show up at every point where a decision is happening to stop these things. So that can look like attending your zoning committee meetings in your town, your city council meeting. As Elizabeth mentioned, Department of Natural Resources and Public Service Commissions have public hearings on different permits. And you can prepare your testimony ahead of time. So you can think about what you want to say. Remember that personal experiences and stories move decision makers more than facts. So while we all want to share all the facts we know about the harm that data centers can cause, that isn't what sticks with people and isn't necessarily how people make decisions. So make sure what you're saying is clear and simple. Say what you want from the decision maker, both at the start and the end of what you're saying. And don't be intimidated. These public hearings are meant to get public feedback. And there have been intimidation tactics that have been used in other places. But the community that's there needs to remember that we're in this together, and we're at these public hearings because the elected officials and government staff should be listening to all of us. So you can put your testimony tools to work. So you can use that section of the toolkit to prepare for upcoming decisions at the Public Service Commission about how much we all have to pay for data centers. So We Energies has one that's about any large hyperscale data center in their territory, and then Alliant, the Beaver Dam data center cost plan. Both of those have hearings coming up in February, so put those dates in your calendar. Be ready to show up online and testify or submit written comments. And we'll send those links around as well. And I really just want to emphasize what we're learning from organizers across the state. Act proactively. So if you can, before a data center proposal even comes to your community, work with your city council or your zoning committee and look at those ordinances and comprehensive plans that Melissa mentioned. What can be strengthened so that your community already has good rules on the books for if a proposal comes and shows up. Show up early and often. Something we just saw with the Greenleaf proposal being dropped is that it went from being announced to having a Facebook page with 3,000 people following and a community town hall to being canceled all within 7 days. And so those early actions are so important. You should also focus on building relationships with other people who care about this, but also with your city council members and others who have the power to protect you, but might not be used to thinking through this or might have never seen a proposal that's multiple billions of dollars. So setting up your friends and your community for success is so important. Be loud and visible, keep going, and then find common ground with your neighbors. So I think we all know that it is a hyper politicized dynamic, and it can be hard to find agreement, but something we're seeing is that people all across the political spectrum have concerns with what these data centers are doing and the threats that they bring to communities. So there are ways to work together even if you don't agree on all things across the board. So keep that in mind as you are working on this. And I will pass it back to Michael to summarize the action opportunities and bring us into the Q&A.
Thanks, Cassie. So before we turn to the Q&A, we wanted to leave you with a few action items. So first, you should mark your calendars for those dates in February when the Public Service Commission will be having hearings on these data center tariff cases. Again, these are the cases that are going to determine whether tech companies pay their fair share for data center development, or whether the public ends up getting saddled with higher energy bills. So I know it sounds like a very technical process, but these are very important cases, and there's public hearings on February 10th and February 24th. We'll also be having that webinar on February 4th to discuss these cases in more detail and help you prepare if you wish to comment in those. Again, that webinar is going to be February 4th at 6 p.m. And then finally, we encourage you to get involved if there's a local group in your area that's organizing on this issue. Like we said, local opposition has been extremely effective in stopping some of these projects. And if there's not a project in your area, we also encourage you to sign up for one of our organizational lists. All of the organizations you heard from tonight operate statewide, and we track this issue very closely. Okay, so with that, we're going to move on to the question and answer portion. If you have additional questions, feel free to put them in that Q&A section. I've seen a number of good questions already come into the chat. I think the first one we're going to start with is um, in cases where the companies decided to pull out of a community, what was the reason why they did so? What was effective? Is there anyone that wants to jump in on this one? Cassie, you want to take that?
Sure. So what we're seeing is people who are showing up in mass early on in a project proposal. The further that these get down the line, the harder it is to stop or change plans. That's not to say that guardrails can't be put in place still, and we should keep fighting for that. But I think the being loud, being clear about what you want, having mass turnout from the community that the proposal is in, and working with local leaders to myth bust some of the lies that they're getting from big tech companies about why these would be so beneficial and how they wouldn't have negative impacts.
Yeah, the thing I would add to that is the projects that are being stopped, it's almost always because of local opposition and convincing your local elected officials to be against a project. Another question we got was how do we overcome misinformation about data centers? And Cassie, I think you might be a good one to answer that as well.
I think any of us can, but the toolkit is a great resource as a starting point. And then there are a ton of resources that are popping up, and it's been really exciting to see in Wisconsin people who have concerns about data centers coming together and sharing resources in a really collaborative way. And so there's a lot of expertise that can be looked to. Um, and then yeah, those one-on-one conversations and making sure that decision makers are asking nuanced questions. So, oh, we're not going to use water. Okay, but are you using more water than in power generation, or and just offsetting where that's happening? So, thinking through what marketing logic might be used and how that can be overcome.
We have another question here on whether Wisconsin might be building new coal plants to power the data center boom. And I'm happy to weigh in on this. I would say it is unlikely that new coal plants are going to be built in Wisconsin. It's basically a uneconomic form of new energy at this point. However, I will say that coal plant retirements are being delayed because of data center energy demand. We've seen that in Wisconsin, we're seeing it nationally. And the longer that those coal plants run, the more expensive the energy is. It also harms the local communities from air pollution that coal emits. And then it also contributes to climate change. And then while we might not see new coal plants built in Wisconsin, we are seeing a large amount of gas-fired power plants proposed by utilities, and those emit harmful air pollution, just like coal plants do. And they also contribute to climate change. So there's definitely a lot of concerns that this data center boom is going to lead to locking in greenhouse gas emissions for decades, uh, and harming the communities through local air pollution. Let's see. We also got a question about the dueling bills that are currently in the Wisconsin legislature. Um, is there anyone who wants to jump in on that question? If not, I can just briefly weigh in. So there's two bills currently before the Wisconsin legislature, sort of directly addressing the data center question. One of them is Assembly Bill 722. It's primarily supported by Democratic legislators, um, and it has some positive things in it. Things like water use reporting, energy efficiency requirements for data centers, has a prevailing wage element, so that the labor that builds a data center uses prevailing wage. It also does some funding for energy conservation programs in the state. And then it finally ties the tax exemptions that we currently give for free. It ties that to them using at least 70% clean energy. So, in my mind, as an environmental community advocate, those are some positive provisions. I think it serves as a first step on this issue. There's also more recently introduced Assembly Bill 840. This one is primarily supported by Republican legislators. And one thing I'll note in there is that it includes a sort of anti-clean energy provision, and that it requires any clean energy that is going to be going to a data center to be on the site of a data center. And I think any data center developer is going to tell you that's basically unworkable to power all of their energy needs by on-site clean energy generation. And so the result of that provision likely would be to increase the fossil fuel power that's going to these facilities, which obviously has many negative environmental and community impacts.
Michael, can I add something? Just briefly on AB 840, I think it is. The one thing I liked in there is it talked about decommissioning. So in the advent that these facilities either go bust or now need to be downsized, AB 840 does talk about decommissioning and the responsibility of decommissioning that facility. So in other words, any deconstruction, cleanup actually falls back onto the developer rather than onto the municipality, which all too frequently can happen. Company A up and leaves, and now the municipality's left with a property they may not be able to take care of. So that is one redeeming quality of that bill.
Thank you. And it's good to see that both parties are feeling the pressure from the public to the extent that they feel they have to introduce legislation on this issue. It's a sign that the local advocacy and organizing is working. Let's see, we have a question here about increasing energy costs on consumers. So would the increase in energy bills be due to the new infrastructure being built, or would it be due to the cost of the energy itself being passed on to consumers instead of the data center owner? Is there anyone who wants to jump in on that?
I can start. So it's both, and it's kind of complicated with how our energy system works. But from the start of it needing as much energy as they do, the utilities will have to build new infrastructure. So that means new transmission lines, new power plants. Like Michael said, a lot of gas plants are being proposed, but there's renewable energy being proposed too, but just all of that has to be built. And so who pays for that is a big question. If 100% of it goes to a data center, they should have to pay 100%, but that's not guaranteed. But then there's this question of if 90% goes to a data center, the rest of the customers get 10%, but it wouldn't have been built without the demand for the data center. Who pays for that? So it gets a little complicated. So there's the new infrastructure on the system. And then if there's a lot of gas put on the system, there is a question of what that does in terms of gas prices and fluctuations, and just this idea of supply and demand. So if we suddenly start using all of this gas to power data centers, what does that mean for the gas needed for the rest of customers? And the price of that gas. So it's kind of a twofold issue. And then, of course, as the demand on the system goes up, things that just in general, things like transmission lines, things like facility staff that's needed to just help our electricity system work. As the more electricity happens, you need more of that sort of infrastructure and high level and kind of operating. So that increases the cost of electricity and who pays for that, whether that's data centers or not. Without protections, we would all be helping kind of foot that bill. So it's the entire electricity process from is kind of implicated when we are talking about this much of an expansion.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So we got another question here about the health impacts and whether there are opportunities for Wisconsin public health practitioners and researchers to help address these concerns. Brittany, that one feels teed up for you.
Yes, so the health voice, public health voice, is very powerful in the opposition of these large projects. So being a health professional and as has been outlined, engaging early and at the local level is really where you have the most power. So having those like one-on-one conversations with those local elected officials, elevating the resources cited in the toolkit and other research as it comes forward will be very powerful to help them center the health impacts in their decision making. Then there are also opportunities to engage with like the Wisconsin DNR and the Public Service Commission, and the health voice is important and powerful there. But I will say that the greatest success with stopping these is at the local level and early, and we still need to continue to engage and push back in the PSC proceedings as well as with the DNR air permits.
Thanks, Brittany. Another question here is about whether these data centers are being built upon speculation or if they're being driven by demand. I think that the answer to that is both. Nationally, many proposals are being built upon speculation, which is really a concern from the energy standpoint. If a project is being built on speculation and used to justify lots of new electrical infrastructure, and then ultimately that project falls through, the public could end up holding the bag for that electrical infrastructure. Here in Wisconsin, we're also seeing a bit of both. Microsoft is building a data center that it's going to use. That's pretty direct. But some of the other companies like Vantage and QTS, these are companies that own the data center and lease that space out to other users. So in those cases, it's a little bit harder to say exactly who the ultimate user of that data center would be. And then I know we're just coming up on an hour here. I think one last question I want to turn to is the Great Lakes Compact. We got a question about whether the Great Lakes Compact would restrict these proposals near the Great Lakes. And my sense of this is that if a data center was making a large water withdrawal directly from Lake Michigan or Lake Superior, that would require certain permitting requirements under the Great Lakes Compact. There would also be restrictions if they wanted to move water outside of the Great Lakes Basin for a data center. However, one of the challenges we've seen is that the data center developers are pretty savvy and they typically want to get connected to a municipal water system, which is why they keep trying to get annexed into cities and villages. And once they get connected to a municipal water system, then the municipality provides the water, and it sort of allows the data center to avoid another permitting process that they would have to go through if they were withdrawing the water directly. So the Great Lakes Compact could be relevant, but we've seen these companies be pretty savvy at avoiding permitting requirements where they can. And with that, I know we've come up on an hour. So I want to thank you all for taking the time to join us this evening. Like I said earlier, we'll follow up with an email that will include a recording, the slides, as well as opportunities to continue to get involved. We're envisioning this being part of an ongoing series with that next session coming up in early February. So we hope to see you again and we hope that you find a lot of use out of the local toolkit. So thank you all for being here and have a great night.